Well, good morning to you, and can I say happy Thanksgiving? It is so good to see you, and what a blessing it is, and I am thankful for each and every one of you, and I'm thankful for my family that meets here. If you're visiting with us, let me tell you that we're so happy that you're here, and we'd love for you to become a part of our family, and I'm thankful that you've come our way, and we're glad that we can worship together on this first day of the week. Have you ever thought that it's all about me? Not it's all about Scott Tillman, but it's all about me as in you. Is it all about me? Have you ever thought that? Maybe not consciously, but maybe in the back of your mind, you think about how this world turns and how the events of this world turns. And sometimes we find ourselves in the center of what we think is our universe, don't we? We think about ourselves, and maybe you've even had that kind of conversation with some people before, that here I stand and that things seem to revolve around me. Well, I hate to burst your bubble. Today I want to tell you it's not about you. I hate to maybe display that myth, but it's not about you, but I think you're going to find great joy in actually what it's all about. Again, happy Thanksgiving, and we're really glad you're here. You do need to know that if you're visiting with us, that we're in the middle of a long study, a 32-week study from the story. It's actually, we're going through the Bible. And we're reading through Scripture, and we're looking at how God's story unfolds, ultimately to find our own place in the story. And we've come to the book of 1 Samuel. It's actually two books in our modern Bible, but did you know it was only one scroll? But the scroll was so long, it was so lengthy, that we divided it to make it easier for us to digest. It's the story of how God continues to pursue covenant relationship with his people. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, when Israel is rescued from slavery in Egypt, God made a covenant with them. And eventually, there on Mount Sinai, he makes this covenant with them, and he promises them a land that will be their very own, and they make it to the promised land where you think all things are going to be great. Where you think, well, we finally have made it. Here we are. God has established this land for us. He's making us his people, but only if they could keep their end of the bargain. If only they could keep their end of the bargain. What we keep finding is they keep failing at what they're supposed to do by keeping his covenant commands. And God continues to try to find way after way to bring them back into relationship with him. By the way, do you ever find yourself maybe in that very same place? No matter how much you strive and long to live this life that God has called us to, we continue to sometimes fail. We continue to do the things that we don't want to do. We're put in that situation where even Paul says, the things that I want to do, I don't do, but the things I don't want to do, I do them. We know exactly how the people of Israel felt, don't we? We know exactly how it feels to have a desire for covenant relationship, for this long vow that we want to promise God, and how we have such a hard time living up to our end of the bargain. Aren't you glad? Aren't you thankful that someone renegotiated the contract for us? That someone being Jesus Christ. And that's ultimately what this story is all about. But before we get to Jesus, we have to think about what is happening here in 1 Samuel. Before Samuel, we see, of course, the book of Judges and how Israel needed faithful leaders. Well, that was some kind of read, wasn't it? Full of death and murder and crazy. Can we just call it crazy? And to even call the book Judges or these war leaders judges throws me off, because I want to think of someone with a gavel that's hitting on his podium, that's giving judgment or casting down sentence. But we're really talking about, in the book of Judges, someone that's going to war, a general, maybe, if you will, that continues to fight time and time again. And we see some that are good, and we see some that are bad. And Israel so desperately needed leaders that sought to be what God wanted them to be. And there's where we come to Samuel. The Samuel provides an answer for this need. It focuses on three main characters, as you know. 1 Samuel, where we get the title for the book. He's more than just a prophet. He really becomes that judge and sometimes even executioner in the book. Then it focuses on King Saul, the first human king of Israel that seems to have it all. And lastly, it focuses on King David, one who has a heart patterned after God's heart. It's through these three main characters that God transitions Israel from a group of tribes into a united kingdom ruled by David in Jerusalem. Don't you love to see the end of the story? Aren't you glad that we're privileged to the end of the story, where we see how God works through some crazy circumstances to come to his end, to come to the things that he desires? We look at how Samuel becomes the key leader of Israel, only to be heartbroken late in his life when the elders of Israel come, and what do? They ask for a king. They ask for a leader. They ask for a king because we want a king like other nations. Why would Samuel be so heartbroken? Because he has led these people. He has been that moral compass that they so strongly needed. And he cries out to the Lord. What does God tell him, by the way? They want a king? Give them one. Give them a king. Be careful what you wish for. Maybe we should stop, and maybe I should just preach on that for a minute, because I think maybe even sometimes we need to hear that. Be careful what you wish for, because sometimes you get it. We want a king. Great. Here you go. We're going to take your sons, they're going to be part of the army. We're going to take your daughters, they're going to serve in our kingdom. Oh, by the way, we're going to tax you. We're going to take the best of your crops. What, you wanted a king? Here you go. Parents, have you ever had your child ask you for something that you knew wouldn't be good for them? And you got so frustrated, they continued to beg for it, they continued to beg for it, and finally you go, okay, here you go. Only you know the outcome, what it's going to be. You'll shoot your eye out. Right? And we're just waiting for that moment because we know what's going to happen. How many times does God do that with us? You want a king? Okay, here you go. And Saul really is a tragic figure because he's so full of promise at the beginning. He's tall, he's good looking, he's a great warrior, he's a perfect candidate for the kingdom, for being a king. Oh, but he is flawed. He has some deep, deep character flaws. He's dishonest. He lacks integrity. He's full of pride. He seems incapable of acknowledging his own inadequacies. In all those things, what he really lacks is trust in the Lord. All these flaws become his downfall. And it eventually disqualifies him from being king when he blatantly disobeys the Lord. So Samuel, he informs Saul, the Lord, he's rejected you. Could there be anything worse said to someone? Is there anything worse that could be said to anyone? The Lord has rejected you. You see, this starts his downfall. And a lot of times we think we understand the circumstances and why he does the things he does. It all stems back to this moment when the Lord rejects him, when Samuel tells Saul, you no longer will be king because of what you've done today. Couldn't you wait to sacrifice? I was on my way. But you thought you were bigger than the Lord. That's a constant thread we see throughout Scripture. At the same time that this event is unfolding, God is working behind the scenes. Doesn't he always? Amen. Doesn't he work behind your scenes as well, even when you don't know it? And he's raising up a new king. It's an insignificant shepherd. It's the most least likely candidate for becoming the king. But aren't you amazed at how often God takes the unqualified to do great things? You see, God demonstrates that his choice is not based on family status, but on radical trust in him. We see a shepherd boy named David. God sees a slayer of Goliath. We see the last one of his family. God sees a heart. David becomes the greatest king of Israel's history. But Saul had everything right in front of him, didn't he? Who would have ever thought, just looking for mules, that I would become the king? And he squanders it away. And he absolutely squanders it away by thinking it's all about me. Are you willing to squander it away? Are you willing to give it all away by thinking it's all about you? Radical trust in the Lord. Radical trust in the Lord. That's what we're commanded for. To understand that God is working in the hardest moments and that He'll work it out if we will just be faithful. From this point in the story, we see Saul's slowly descent. And he becomes mad, insane. We see him become so jealous over David's rise for power when all David was trying to do was serve him well. In our reading today, Saul is slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. His jealousy ate at him. Instead of realizing that David was just an extension of his leadership. I saw preach Brother Denny reading that lengthy reading today of Saul chasing David. Can you think of anyone else that could read that passage as well as Brother Denny? And he comes to a cave. By the way, how many men did he have as he pursued David? 3,000 men. David had 30 mighty men. We'll get to that shortly. And so we see Saul's jealousy as he tries to hunt him. Saul displays his own fear, paranoia, and jealousy toward David. But what has David done? Only serve the king well. He's shown great courage, humility in the way that he handles Saul pursuing him in his opposition. What David really learned, it's not about you. I need you to hear this next statement. Each one of you needs to hear this because it will help you in this life. It's not about you. Sometimes your spirit will irritate others' demons. Did you hear that? It's not about you. But there are times in this life when your good spirit will irritate others' demons and you will feel attacked, and it's not about you. Just keep letting the Spirit live through you. It's not about you. Saul didn't hate David, though he pursued him and wanted to kill him. Saul wasn't really frustrated with David. Saul's jealousy, his anger, his rage, his insanity stems from his regret for not being what God had called him to be. It's not about you. There's always something else behind the story. In the middle of these times, when people attack us, it's in the middle of those times that we have a chance to show our true character. And so I want to give you two things this morning that I think will help you be like David when others pursue you, when you feel like others attack you, when your spirit irritates their demons. Number one, resist harming those who oppose you. That goes against everything that we think growing up. That goes against everything we think should happen. When you're growing up, someone strikes you, what do you really want to do? Strike them back. But not just strike them back. What do we want to do? We want to strike them back so much harder that they would never even think of striking us in the first place. But what does Jesus tell us to do? Turn the other cheek. You see, because he knows it's not about you. He knows there's something that's underlying the problem. David has the opportunity to kill Saul in this cave, doesn't he? He's even encouraged to do so by his mighty men, those closest to him. But he doesn't. He simply trusts that despite Saul's evil, God is at work. Despite Saul's evil, God will raise a king for his people. David is actually affirming Saul's worth. He knows that he's flawed and sinful, but God initially chose him. In Saul's case, he'd been rejected by God as king. His jealousy of David is rooted again in regret. But how does David handle it? Many of David's poems that we find in his collection in the Psalms link back to this period of David's life, doesn't it? All of them seem to express the same attitude of trusting the Lord. So resist harming those who oppose you. And then number 2, make the first move to reconcile. David seeks to reconcile with Saul. At great risk to himself, he comes out to the mouth of the cave and he cries out to Saul to clarify. How should we approach our enemies? Sitting back and waiting for them to make the first move feels natural and justified. But God gives us the strength and courage to move towards our enemies. Who are you avoiding today? These stories are told really as character studies. In order that we see ourselves in the middle of the story. In Saul's story, we see a warning. We must reflect on our own character flaws and how they can harm us and others. And with God's help, we need to humble ourselves and deal with our own demons so that our story doesn't become the same as Saul's story. In David, we see an example of patience and trust and waiting on God's timing. When David is running in the wilderness, being chased by Saul, he had every reason to think that God had abandoned him. But David's story encourages us to trust despite human evil, and to know that God is working behind the scenes. God is working behind the scenes to fulfill his purpose. His purpose to oppose the proud and to exalt the humble. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about God and how he is working through our story. Maybe today you have gotten lost in your story. Maybe today you have forgotten that God is working even when you feel abandoned. That's why he gave us the church, to encourage us during those difficulties, to let us hold your hand and walk alongside of you, and to pray for you. If we can do that today, we so would love to. Won't you come while we stand and sing?